Welcome, and on behalf of the European Cultural Center, we are very glad to host this symposium on vertical landscape proposed by Florian Busch architects. Just a few practical information. So there is no coffee break for this during the program, but on the other side here, so maybe there's coffee and tea if you want to grab it whenever you want. And we invite you to stay with us at the end of the conference. There will be 1 hour networking snacks, so everyone can meet and speak. So I give the words to Florian Busch, and have a nice moment.
Thank you very much, Berenice. Thank you very much, ECC. I'm very honored to be joined by 7 outstanding experts, and we will have a look at the wider idea of what it means to go towards a density in the urban environment without sacrificing openness. The 10 largest urban agglomerations dated in 2018. As you can see, number 1 was Tokyo, and it may have been overtaken by Delhi, or it will be overtaken by Delhi very soon. As you can see, the only 2 places with declining population are in Asia, in Japan actually. It's Tokyo and the wider Osaka region. And all the others are going up, sharp rises. In fact, around 2007, around the global financial crisis, there was an interesting point in human history. The urban population for the first time exceeded the rural population globally. And the trend is clear. By 2050, there will be about 70%, the United Nations projects, that live in urban areas. So urbanization. Urbanization is, in principle, a good thing because it is very important that we have density to limit our footprint as humanity. This shows Tokyo, the wider area of Tokyo, in the amount of carbon emissions. And of course, the urban areas have a tremendously larger amount of carbon emissions than rural areas. But the interesting thing here is that actually this graph is wrong if you look at it in relative terms. In absolute terms, this is correct, but if you think about what's the carbon emission per household, the entire chart flips. And that's very important to consider, that we cannot afford to live a rural lifestyle as we know it today. And that's not only Japan. If you look at this, it's the same graph, the same idea for selected cities in the United States. So this gives us a clear indication of the importance of density. The only way we may be able to continue in a sustainable way is to embrace density. And this becomes even more cruel if you think about this graph, which is the projection of the global population. So we are currently at around 8 billion. If you take the medium, here you'll see that around 2080 the global population will peak at around 10.5 billion people on Earth. So that's 2.5 billion added from today in the next 57 years. Just to put this a little bit in perspective, if you want to house 2.5 billion people over the 57 years, we would need a city of 10 million people every 2.7 months. So I guess that kind of gives you an idea of where what kind of issue we are facing. So density is good. This is density the Tokyo way. So you can see big and an ocean of small and big again. And this is very crucial for us to understand how we came about the idea with these vertical landscapes. So it's a different way, and you see increasingly there are clusters of big in Tokyo. And in fact, the government plan is what they call an urban renaissance. Whatever is reborn, I don't know. And if you compare that to what Isozaki said about 60 years ago when he was 31, I think, such city planning has always ended in empty theory, and that is why cities have been kept alive. And that, unfortunately, is no longer true. And unfortunately, I mean, despite the city's inherent complexity, architects, planners, developers, they have all had this vademecum for urban density biased towards solidified enclosures. So there's either the response is what you see on the left, which is kind of a commercial thing where you have a tower with a plinth, or on the right, it's more like a straightforward extrusion of a residential tower. So this has been the knee-jerk reaction in order to increase density. And the problem is that we can see the limitations of enclosures here. It's a tragic disengagement with the city. And the more of these you build, the more you actually de-urbanize. And more public space is turned into privately owned public spaces, which are, of course, the opposite of real public spaces. I've often talked about this in the past, about the Starbucksification. If you go to these commercial areas, and Sharon Zukin, a sociologist, called it the pacification by cappuccino. So we are all happy. We are all, part of this system where, as long as we have enough means to afford, we enjoy these areas. So the conventional response has been the tower with or without plinth. And if you can see, this is left is a diagram of Tokyo. You see big and ocean of small and big, which is completely open. So this entire in-between is walkable. And there's, there's nothing wrong with the vertical per se, but if that's the only response we have, I think we are facing serious issues, and we'll talk about them in the coming presentations. So the problem are the conditions at ground. The conventional high-rise buildings do not understand or care to understand the urban fabric. And that's 20 years ago, Kolas in a Sky thing, criticism of what happened in Tokyo actually, said more and more of the world's ground floor is handed over to Jerde, whose universal blueprint seamlessly closes off all horizons, blocks all the exits, eliminates all perspective. Now, criticism is nothing new. We have had it, as we could see from Kolas, it was preceded by Arata Isozaki, who I've mentioned. Then there's, of course, in the 60s and 70s, Henri Lefebvre, Jane Jacobs, David Harvey, Sharon Zukin. They all are aware of the dangers that come with that kind of urbanism. But also not new is the recognition that repeating the conditions at ground level in the air provides density and openness, at the same time, the importance of openness. So in 1954, Le Corbusier's disciple, Yoshizaka, came back to Japan during the massive reconstruction after World War II, and he wrote in a very small article, "It is not necessary to make all the fine details of the home with our current budget for public housing. What we need to do is to make land." And he continued, "Fortunately, the space in the sky above Tokyo is still relatively unoccupied." So that's his sketch from the time. It's rather modest and quite cute, actually. He's not the only one. This is from New York, the Starrett Lehigh building, where much more functional, every floor is a first floor, or in a also quite cute and quaint romantic idea, all the comfort of the country with none of its disadvantages, an advertisement of 1909. So in principle, it has a strong point. The urban lacks the openness of the rural. They all understand the necessity to multiply the ground, and they all understand the problem of the enclosed. And where they all struggle is continuity. Vertical landscapes introduce a new urban typology. From the only response is solidified mass to the continuation of the city's land, streets, squares, parks, in the air. Open to anyone at any time, these man-made landscapes are the natural extension of the urban ground conditions at ground level. So you can see we would think that we continue these small up. And by the time when we are in the air, we realize that we can actually start hanging from the land, suspending. Now suspension has a tremendous advantage. It's the minimal material effort that you need versus compression. And you can see that we have another way to deal with density, to increasing density in the urban context. Vertical landscapes are not a building, they are infrastructure. Infrastructure multiplying the city's ground without architecture's compulsive desire to determine. You can see that there's, in principle, we have a surface, we have a place for people to have housing, or it could be shops, it could be what you see normally on street level in the city. And the overall structural system is something like this. This is just a prototype. Vertical landscapes are not about height per se. This is not, we don't have to go as high, we could go higher, we could go lower. It's about the principle. So instead of density as striated enclosure, we can add vertical landscapes that lead another way. Density in openness. More ground means more of the bottom-up evolution which lets a city thrive. And finally, not a master plan. Vertical landscapes are not a blanket solution trying to undo the city as we've seen in the past and we'll be seeing in the next presentations. They are local interventions which seek opportunity and respond flexibly. They are one of several possible solutions to a problem too complex for one-size-fits-all approach. So this, in a nutshell, kind of big nutshell, sorry, is what the vertical landscapes are about. Density of openness. And that's possible and even logical precisely because of the heterogeneity of the city. In general, and Tokyo gives a remarkable example of that from which we derived these vertical landscapes. So let the next speakers show us why and how and what that could mean on a global stage. And I would like to hand over to Christian Dimmer, who is a professor at Waseda University in Tokyo, and who will give us a bit background about the urbanism in Tokyo. Thank you very much.
Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I would like to look a little bit into Tokyo's struggle between verticality and horizontality in order to get a better sense of how these problems are manifesting, the problems of the old Le Corbusian city of the tower in the parks, and how is it colliding with the alleyways. This is a photo I took a few years ago, and I just marked all the super high-rise buildings higher than 99 meters, just to give us an idea of how they are impacting on the city. And originally, the system was introduced to Japan with the promise to create valuable public spaces. So if you create a valuable public space, you shall be allowed to build a big tower and make a profit. So I put together this graph here. It shows us on the left-hand side, or the black line is the number of accumulated super high-rise buildings higher than 99 meters from 1968, when the first tower was built, to 2024. In gray, we see the numbers of buildings completed per year. And in red, I added important events that happened. The important thing to keep in mind is Japan entered its economic crisis that is already lasting now for over 30 years. And during the economic crisis, the number of high-rise buildings went up by 786%, just as a side note. So while building towers has become a machine to jumpstart the economy, if we want to put it very bluntly. Japan wasn't always comfortable with high-rise buildings. Imagine Japan is one of the most earthquake-prone countries in the world. So mastering seismic and earthquake-proof architecture is a very important point. So you had to construct a kind of desire and a kind of faith to live in high buildings. This is a film that was shot or released in 1969. Called the Dawn of the Super High Rise, where we see in nearly 3 hours documentary style film how the first skyscraper is built, and seeing also the amazing architects and engineers who are mastering all the odds and to make it happen. Of course, if we go back, there is the old Le Corbusian idea of the Plan Voisin, 1925, to do away with the old city, to move it away, to tear it down, to remove the old and replace it with the new from slate, and to develop a universalized solution. Of course, we all know this very famous model picture here, where the most exciting part of Paris is sacrificed for ample green air and views. In Japan as well, it took an effort to make the high-rise city a reality. One of the proponents was Minoru Mori, the founder of, or the second president of Mori Building in Tokyo. The builder who pushes Tokyo into the clouds is the headline by the New York Times. Or Minoru Mori, Tokyo Tower developer, the Tokyo Tower developer as well. So Roppongi Hills was his poster child, opening in 2003. And back then, he also unveiled an exhibition called The Global City, where we would see these kind of high-rise models. Mori Building, of course, making a business model of building and replacing the old vernacular city with towers. This is a diagram here, or a model picture from his policy that he published as well in 2003, called the Urban New Deal, tongue-in-cheek reference to FDR in the United States, and there as well the New Deal in order to jumpstart the economy. So I'm not sure how ironically this was meant. So the logic here, obviously, you can replace these kind of very inefficient, small-scale 300 buildings, and you build one big tower. You free up 97% of the land for nice, beautiful open space. But if we look more closely here in the foreground, in the vernacular city, this is the Tokyo that we all love, the low-rise Tokyo, the Tokyo of the alleyways. Tokyo with inclusive zoning that allows building owners to change the land use. You have 300 owners, 300 vested interests, 300 stakeholders interested in local politics and invested in the community. 300 front gardens and 300 entrances, 300 times the eyes on the street, to use Jane Jacobs as Florian as well remarked. And very often it didn't really look like that. Over the last 20 years or so, I was studying privately owned public spaces in Tokyo that were created through these kind of processes. And very often we see high rises, and they're towers, but they're not located in a park, as Le Corbusier had hoped for. But it's gray, it's sealed, it's hardly usable. And on the right-hand side, we see one of these fascinating back alleys that many foreign urbanists coming to Tokyo are so fascinated with. Mori was massively pushing for deregulation as well of building regulations in order to allow for more high-rise buildings to be built. Those are a few pictures here and diagrams from the Global City exhibition of 2003. And in the brochure, it also says Tokyo is horizontally overcrowded and yet vertically undeveloped. And we see a juxtaposition here of Manhattan and of Tokyo. With the subtext, we don't have enough high-rises in Tokyo. We need to have more towers, more high-rises. And of course, Mori Building will help you to create this city. And by that, we can then create a more balanced relationship between daytime and nighttime population and create more open space per capita. But open space per capita seems to be the only value that is being presented here, as if it was a worthy end in itself. This is another diagram here from Mori's vertical garden city. And we see this kind of themed landscape here, beautiful towers in a park, very cute. And we see this kind of entertainment landscape at the bottom here. We don't see the vernacular city. We don't see the everyday Tokyo here. This is somewhere outside. This is a kind of simulacrum here, and not the authentic, gritty, urbane city that many of us urbanists appreciate. The quote was already brought up by Florian before, but I wanted to bring the visual as well. Rem Koolhaas in 2003, along with his text, also added this photo montage here with a katana slicing up Mori Tower and saying that this is a permanent house of horror, quote. Meaning, yes, it's beautiful, but it's a gigantic shopping mall that is only accessible from very few entry places, and that is very ill-connected to the rest of the city, creating a rather segregated enclave rather than some kind of continuous urban fabric where people of different walks of life are rubbing elbows. Yeah, this is another text part here from Mori's vertical garden cities here. So it is about cementing Tokyo's positioning among the megacities of the Asian region and stimulating the economy. We don't hear a lot about urbanity. We don't hear a lot here about authentic public life, about mixing of people of different social classes, of social integration, about community structures and so forth. All that seems to matter here is economic value. Another problem with the skyscraper city is as well that it is so far a closed system, that there is an asymmetry between the designers and those who are subjected to the design. I picked this picture here of Kisho Kurokawa's famous capsule tower, but basically you can take any tower so far. Any conventional tower is a kind of closed system that is following the rules of the management and of the designers. And the occupant, the resident, is subjected to life in there, and has only very narrow options to change their life. If we go from Tokyo for a little bit, a very short excursion, if we look to China as well, Yes, in Tokyo, the high-rise is working comparatively well. We don't see the social problems associated with high-rise housing in other countries. If we go to China here, and if we see now one typology copy and pasted dozens and dozens of times and hundreds of times, and we see what kind of environment this is creating here, where people hardly meet the other anymore, where we are segregated in compounds and enclaves, where we're moving between these kind of compounds, all urban life is grinding to a halt. If we're going to other cities as well, this is Mumbai here, we see this kind of very sharp segregation. Above is the city of the wealthy, the city of the rich. At the bottom, we see the Havi, the world's largest slum, the city of the poor, sharply divided. So how can we overcome this kind of division? How can we create more vertical density by integrating communities, by creating continuity in the city, rather than creating this kind of compoundization and mollification that we're seeing playing out all around the world? So is there a better way towards vertical density? How to create resilient, sustainable cities? This is really the question that I want to bring up for the following speakers as well. And I want the audience to keep this in mind when they are listening to the designers of the vertical landscape. And then maybe later on we can have a discussion how it is performing. Last slide. So Quo Vadis, where to go from here? This is the research here from 2021 that looked into reviewing any kind of research that has been done so far, analyzing the impact of high-rise living on community, on mental health, on health, and so forth. And the research is suggesting that there are significant negative psychological and social impacts. Although we have to be also clear that this is playing out very differently in different socioeconomic, cultural contexts as well. So we shouldn't generalize here. But the most important sentence, and with this I want to close, is, quote, however, there is ample evidence that many of these impacts can be reduced or eliminated through responsible design innovation. So high-rises per se are not bad. We need vertical density. Florian showed you the data, but perhaps we haven't found a good way yet that also works economically, socially, and for the community. So with this, I want to close it. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
So before we start designing as architects, actually a big part of our work is to learn how to read the context that we're working in. We are living and working in Tokyo, so we've had ample opportunity to get to know this context. And so today I would like to just highlight a couple of aspects of Tokyo that inspired the making of this project. If we look at two satellite views, one of Tokyo, one of Venice, I think it's pretty clear which one is which. One is a modern city, big streets, tall buildings, and the other is clearly a historical one. I mean, it would be hard to imagine building an expressway over the Canal Grande, yet that is what happened in Tokyo. However, we have to be careful because actually most of Tokyo looks more like this image. As you can see, the buildings are much smaller, and we find a lot more similarities to Venice. They're both cities that have grown organically over time. So you find actually a network of narrow alleys, which was built for people and animals and not for cars. One big difference, though, is that all the buildings in Tokyo are new. They're on average only 27 years old, while the buildings in Venice, maybe 500 on average, I'm not sure. And what's even more important is that they may still be here 1,000 years from now, while the buildings in Tokyo will all be gone. This culture of urban regeneration in Tokyo didn't arise in a vacuum. This is part of being in a country, where nature is stronger than man, right? So on this graph, you can see how the city has been repeatedly destroyed during the course of history due to earthquakes, fires, floods, and also wars. So it's not just natural destruction, also man-made destruction, and sometimes both go together. As is the case now with the new urban regulations that are, on the one hand, yes, they're stopping this pattern of destruction, but they also imply a form of destruction in themselves. Because if you don't constantly rebuild the city, it won't be able to live up to these regulations. So on this next slide, I think it's very interesting. You compare two images. One is a photo now of Asakusa, which is one of the most historical districts in Tokyo. And on the other hand, you get an image of 200 years ago, what life was like in a similar district. And what's interesting is that in the photo, even though every building is new, it looks like it might have been built yesterday, or else they also look flimsy enough to look like they could be torn down tomorrow. Even though that's true, the life that is happening in between has stayed almost the same. So we could say that resilience in the Japanese city is dependent on this ephemerality, and ephemerality is a form of resilience which keeps the city and its contents alive. In the 1850s, that's when this map of Tokyo was drawn. Tokyo was called Edo, actually, and it had already over 1 million inhabitants. And so even though it had none of the modern infrastructure, it was already one of the largest, if not the largest city in the world. But does it look like a city? In fact, it doesn't make a very hard distinction between city and countryside. It was more like an agglomeration of hundreds of villages, which were permeated by farmlands and nature. And I think that Tokyo still has retained this character in modern times. Each of the communities in Edo had its own character, which was often defined by the terrain. And if we go back even further, around 10,000 years ago, we can see why. This is the area that is now the city center of Tokyo. But 10,000 years ago, it was submerged by the sea and very large rivers, which completely permeated the area. So water is blue and land is white or yellowish. Today, the water has receded to those white lines that you see here. And in fact, the rivers are mostly built over with roads and highways. So you won't see that anymore, but the topography that is left behind, of course, is still felt. And we see this clearly if we take a section through all of the buildings in Tokyo. Let me play this clip. You see how the buildings are climbing up the ridges, and if you paid attention in the beginning, you also saw that many of the buildings are actually built below the sea level. Now, if we take vertical sections, you'll have to look closely, but you'll see that there are all these up and downs in the terrain. But what's, of course, much more striking is that there's also a huge vertical difference between the buildings themselves. So you have these tiny houses built right next to skyscrapers. This is an image of what Tokyo looks like. Not in the outskirts, this is the city center of Tokyo, and that's very important. So it's an image of what density looks like in Tokyo. Very cute and charming. And if you imagine being this lady here, you can see how you would be walking up and down the streets into this kind of environment, which if it wasn't for the tower in the backdrop, I think you could almost think yourself in a village. And despite the intense land use, there's still an abundance of sunlight and greenery, which make it a very attractive walking environment. Another reason why it's such a nice city to walk and even cycle in is that this natural terrain where you walk on is overlaid with a man-made terrain, platforms carrying a dense network of trains and also metros underground. It carries around 40 million passengers a day, so you really don't need a car to get around in Tokyo, which means that it's very easy for anyone, also elderly people and children, to get around, and this means you also walk more and have a healthier life. Now, oh, excuse me. Now, this dense web of small streets makes Tokyo's charm, as we have said, but it comes with its inherent problems. Mostly in the case of an earthquake, these narrow alleys will make it very easy for fires to spread and make it very difficult for rescue teams to come through or for people to evacuate. And that is why the government has been promoting high-rise building and road widening, especially in high-risk areas. These areas at the highest risk are maybe surprisingly not located in the oldest part of the city, but in a ring around it. It's the areas that were rapidly built up during industrialization and post-war reconstruction in the past century. So if we think about the vertical landscapes, these are some of the places that could be most urgently in need of opening up space. But there are other areas that require our urgent attention. Throughout the history of Tokyo, earthquakes have always been a possibility on people's minds. It could happen anytime, but you didn't know when. But with climate change, we are moving closer and closer to the certainty of catastrophic flooding. And when this happens, and this could perhaps happen tomorrow already, 4 to 5 million people would have to be relocated. Now, the reason why Tokyo is so particularly prone or at risk of flooding is that a lot of the residential areas in the lowlands in the east of Tokyo are built below the water level of the rivers. So you can see that if the levees break and the water flows over the embankments, everything will be flooded at once. The government is doing something about it. There are technocratic measures in place, like building these huge water reservoirs and tunnels underneath the city to relieve the city of this overflow of water. But of course, this comes with an enormous price tag, which doesn't do anything to enhance the living environment of the inhabitants. So as architects, we naturally think that it would be wiser to address the root cause of the problem, which is that nature needs to be given more space in the city. Currently, Tokyo is lagging behind in this aspect. We've seen that there's a lot of informal greenery in the little alleys, but in terms of public green space, Tokyo has only 7.5% compared to 27% in New York and even 46% in Sydney. So we are dealing with this paradox that the more people live in one area, the more green space will be needed, but the less is available. So how much do we need exactly? Well, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has a recommendation of a minimum of 9 square meters per inhabitant. And if we follow this standard, we can see that the current green spaces only cover the areas that are painted in black here. So everything that's outside the black is currently lacking in greenery. In the past, there have been plans to remedy this. This was a very specific era just before and after the World War, where government officials were trying to plan this green belt around the city that was modeled after European cities like London and Vienna, trying to contain the sprawl of the city. But the city population grew much faster than the planners could handle, and today the distribution of the population looks like this, and we can see that a lot of the areas that are that were intended to be green are now the most populated. So what we're showing on this graph here is what would happen if you stacked all of the inhabitants of each of Tokyo's over 5,000 city districts on top of each other. And the winning district is over there, more than 30 kilometers tall. So that's quite impressive. But of course, in reality, we cannot stack these people up to create more space for parks. That wouldn't work. But what we are saying is, well, what if we stack the parks on top of each other? If we forget about the buildings for a moment and just look at the structure of open spaces in Tokyo, we find a very beautiful and amazing pattern. And so what we're trying to do is not to impose our own logic or order on top of this, but try to work with the forces of the city, the natural evolution of the city, to create something that will naturally fit into this patchwork. So this is where the vertical landscapes could fit in, based on our analysis of where they would make the most sense. In case you've missed them, you can see them here. So basically today, what is the status quo? We have two competing types of development in Tokyo. We have the low-rise city, where we do have this social cohesion, but we are lacking open spaces, green spaces. And we have the high-rise city that does promise more green, even though it doesn't always come to fruition. But it obviously has this problem of social isolation. So we are maybe somewhat naively asking, how can we get the best of both worlds? So what we do is just look at the common denominator. All buildings in Tokyo are built on this shared topography, and this is actually what has been driving the construction of Tokyo over the centuries and has really influenced the shape of the city and how we experience it. So when we analyze the gradients, and these are gradients that we don't just analyze with the computer, but that we are walking over every day and also cycling. In my personal case, I'm Belgian, so I cycle to the office. So we know very well how they feel, and we discovered then that we could use these same gradients to start folding the topography upwards. And so we are simply saying that we are multiplying the city itself. Here you see all the levels of a prototype vertical landscape next to a sample area of Tokyo of exactly the same size. And so together they form one continuous system. It's not just a continuous system of form, but also one of content. And if by now you're wondering how this could all be built, well, that's perfect, because I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who will be going into the details of the structure. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me. My name's Andrew Johnson. It's a real pleasure to to be speaking with you this morning, and you've had some great background from Florian, Christian, and Joachim about the challenges that we've been facing. And so I'm going to change tact a little bit and talk about technology, I suppose, and how it relates to what we're doing here. And you know, we're looking at what we're talking about here. I'm going to talk a bit about what I like to call structural intuition. And my first slide here is really talking about these are structures. These are not buildings. It really is an extension of the landscape. And my challenge was how do we create a structure, as Florian said, it might be 300 meters tall, it might be 50 meters tall, it might be 100 meters wide, it might be 200 meters wide, but how do we create something that is an environment and a habitat? It's not a building. And to me, that means that as we go into something that is a series of surfaces, or actually here is just an extension of the street. And so, immediately we looked at the environment, in this case Tokyo, but it could be anywhere in the world. And how do we make that vertical structure feel like an extension of the ground plane? And here is a few examples as we look around that Christian focused on earlier as well. And how do we turn that into an environment that people want to be in? And biophilia and biophilic design's been, people are generally familiar with that, but that's changing. I think that as we change the natural landscape of the world, I see now that term biophilia can mean relationship to the environment around us now is an urban one and a changing one. It's not necessarily nature, but it's the environment you're within. And I think here we take our cues from the context and the context around us as we look towards how we would develop a structure here that was organic and that really drew you in and made this a habitat, not a built form. And so, Florian showed a little bit about the organisation of the elements earlier, but when we looked at this from a technical point of view, of course, we look at the geometry, we look at its function, its performance, and we want those two to work hand in hand, and that's how we come up with something that, in my mind, is creates a space that people want to inhabit and use, and it feels natural for them to go through. So we look here, and on the right, you see what I've sort of retitled here as the habitat, but it comes from the amalgamation of a series of the elements that actually form the geometry of a structure that is not a natural building, and we don't want it to feel that way. So we start on the left. If we start to put it together, we have the surfaces, the finishes, which really is our pavements and our roadways, if you like, that we move through or pathways that we move through the building. With that, we have our skeleton, in this case of steel, concrete, and timber elements. We're sitting under that concrete diaphragm. We have the modular elements, or the units that Florian discussed as hanging elements, and we've shown a palette or a variety of different things that they could be, and they could use, depending where our building is. Obviously, technology can play a part in that as to how those elements are used, what their palette materiality is, how they're built, and how they're organised throughout the building. But all this comes together to create, one overall structural form, and that then must function and have a performance in all those aspects that we were speaking about before. And of course, that integrates life safety, structural performance, and comfort. And so we took this form. Look, how does this relate then to what we need to achieve from this structural form? And how do we assemble this to a variety of building typologies? And so the first thing we're interested in, from our point of view, is we looked at this building and looked at its simple systems. Here we'll talk about its lateral system first of all, and it's not like a normal building. It doesn't have a core. It doesn't have eventually braced or shear walls, but we have a form, which is a continuous surface, if you like, that rotates up the building. And if we look at that form, it does create, here on the right, you'll see a natural folding of the floor plates enables to create a bracing system intuitively out of that form. If we carefully locate the columns to to work in harmony with that folded plate, we can create a natural system that creates a stiffness from the folded floor plate, so we're not doubling up with other structural systems. So you can see here in the diagram on the right, in red or pink, you see a diagram that shows a bracing system that's formulated from the folding of the floor plates and strategic locations of the columns to create a diagonal system. And so what does that mean in the context of the structure? It means we don't have those elements that might be in a normal conventional building that impede your organisation, whether it be wayfinding, whether it be visibility through the building. It could be daylight, which Tim will talk about in a bit. You know, the ability to create openings and visibility, and that affects comfort, affects safety. You know, it affects all kinds of things. You know, we know that we want from a healthy building. So utilising this natural form to create an environment that is not a building and is a landscape or a street is really something that was quite important. And we'll talk a little bit later on about how this could be moved to different environments, but we've shown you how this could relate to, you know, talking about Tokyo. You know, we developed a system that can work, you know, different ways and different heights, whether that be with base isolation, whether that be with damping systems. And so if we move a little bit further on with the stability system, you can see that the central portion of the floor plates as they fold naturally forms a cruciform brace structure in two directions. And the animation on the right is really showing the overall performance of that building using the overall width, and you can see the braced form on either side of the central spine. And we have that in two directions. And utilizing full width means that we have a frame that can be utilised, you know, on a low building in Tokyo, for example, in a base isolated sense, or we can utilise in a taller building with separated bracing systems. We could integrate plastic hinge zones in the centre, or even damped bracing systems through the centre. So it's a system that can be utilised in all parts of the world, whether it be high seismic zones, high wind zones, tall or short, and it's inherent in the form of the building. So no additional structure over and above that geometry that is not needed, as I mentioned a minute ago. Again, the continuous form of the building naturally provides a torsional stiffness to the frame. So from top to bottom, we have a continuous surface. And again, with the columns, then their location strategically around the outside to follow that surface, it allows us to create a structure that has a natural stiffness both laterally but also torsionally. So again, working with that form to create something that's intuitive in its performance as it is habitat. And if you think about gravity structure, you know, one of the things that we worked hard on and spent a fair bit of time on, he was talking about the human scale of the structure and something that can respond to different heights and different scales, but again, feel like it had a natural organisation, one that wasn't necessarily defined by a system. And a grid that felt like something that you can enjoy and vary as you went through the building, and that started with us really defining a certain geometry or size of column that we felt comfortable with, and then working from the top down to add elements in or erode them from the bottom, if you like, in order to maintain and create an element size that we felt was comfortable when we organised the rest of the spaces around it. On the left-hand side here, you see some elevations through the building of those columns eroding. On the right, you see a plan at a typical floor that shows some of the organisation. The white columns, or the cruciform columns there, are located strategically to form the bracing system of the folded floor plates. The black columns tend to run top to bottom, and then the red or the pink columns are various sizes of road as you move up the building, creating differences in spaces, and the building tends to open up, not the buildings, the structure tends to open up as you move from bottom to top. And a little bit about materials and surfaces. We really strive to create a structure that was buildable now with technology that we have, but assembling those materials in a way that both gave it structural performance, but also gave it interest and healthiness. And you'll see, on the left, that assembly that I spoke about earlier of the reinforced concrete diaphragms, perhaps on CLT formwork. And on the right-hand side, there's an image of the model that you may get to visit if you haven't in the Palazzo. Please do and go and have a look. It's a fabulous model. Our columns created out of concrete filled steel, in this case, for the tallest building, our model was based on 300-meter tall building. They could easily be different materials in different scales of building or smaller scales of building. Primary beams out of steel and timber between those columns, but then once we get to the secondary and the tertiary beams, this desire to introduce as much timber as we can within the building and into that form. The use of timber wherever possible as a natural material, we know is healthy, we know it's comforting, we know it's calming, and so our desire to introduce that into the building for healthy reasons, but also for lightness of weight. Particularly in seismic zones or areas with poor foundation conditions. And so to extend that, in my final slide, a little bit about materiality and, just in the structure that we developed with FBA here, you can see on a typical surface in here by volume, we came up with a solution with around 50% timber in there. You can see 47% concrete, which is predominantly the diaphragm and the surface material, and very little steel by volume in there. In the overall structure, that changes a little bit when you introduce the vertical structure or the columns through, but you still end up with by volume 40% of timber. And we really believe that they're important. There's not a structure that we're doing today that doesn't need to think forward around embodied carbon and its impact on both the environment, but also on the building within. And I think there's certainly more opportunity here to integrate natural materials. If we look at a single surface, we find that we've got approximately 7,000 square meters of surface area just from timber beams. And a timber soffit, let's say CLT soffit to the concrete diaphragms, would add even more, significantly increase that number. So, my message today is that, listening to the issues we heard earlier about densification, and we've heard about 2.5 billion people in the next, I think, 57 years. You said, Florian. To me, what that means is we need to create structures that are intuitive and that people want to use. We have cities that are, all of them are brownfield sites now. We're regenerating those areas, and how do we regenerate those in a way that people want to use them? Thank you.
So good morning, everyone, and good evening to the people in Tokyo. So my aim today here is trying to lead you through a short journey around challenges, needs, and opportunities. So since I met Florian, we discussed around the vertical landscapes concept. The concept led me to a sort of vision, let's call it a post-anthropocentric kind of vision around the built environment. And so I've asked myself, okay, how can I introduce this? And so I borrowed a manifesto from a philosopher, Leonardo Caffo. He presented this for an exhibition in Venice 2 years ago, so it's a perfect match with where we are today for the Venice Biennale 2023. And if you go through the manifesto of a post-anthropocentric architecture, essentially I think there are a series of food for thoughts that are very useful. So building means integration with the landscape and not breaking it. So landscape appears here. Second, designing means using the elements of the project without ever consuming them. So it's about how we can ensure circularity. Living means realizing the human form of life in space, and the presentation from Florian, Joachim, Christian were very much about also this. Regularities are an abstraction of domination we cannot longer afford. And regularities, I will come back to this point in my presentation, is about how we are conceiving buildings versus landscape versus the city. And finally, everything that is not designed to be reintegrated into nature without destroying it should no longer be designed. This is a very strong statement. So, if we move into another concept, into another space, mental space, when we talk about another concept strong, which is about regeneration or regenerative design. So let's have a look to these 4 points in this list. So are we designing for human and nature? And which nature? What relationship between us and nature? Is the nature that we likes? Is the nature we belong to? Is the nature in which we live and thrive, or is even the nature that constitutes a threat to us? I think it's all of that. And the places are important. And this, again, goes back to what has been said so far. And I would like to move to the second point, redefining boundaries and relationships. I think the Vertical Landscapes project is very much into this kind of, area, because when we talk about boundaries that are defining what is inside, what is outside, what is architecture, what is landscape, what is organic, what is inorganic, what is urban, what is nature, what is virtual versus physical world. So all these different entities have boundaries, but also they have strong relationships. So redefining the relationships means rethink about the entities, but also rethink about what type of world we are shaping today. Do we want a world that we are shaping a world of, strong hubs, centralities, or do we want to shape a world of connections and networks? The lightness versus the weightness is probably one of the key characteristics of what we are talking about. And we are talking about time. So time is the time of the history, is the past time, is the present time, is the future time. So time is definitely one of the key points, I think, in this project as well, because we've got a megastructure, and we've got functions and units within the megastructure. And when we think about time, we are used to think about how the past time has defined us in the present. So we have to move from the past to the future, and the uncertainty increases. So moving to the future means how the future will look like, and going backwards to the present. I'll explain this in a second with some examples. And finally, if the complexity increases, how we capture the complexity and how we manage it. That's where digital gets in, and we have seen a lot of digital already in the previous presentation. So let's move into this uncertainty space. So we touched climate change already. And that's one of the key challenges we are facing. So no matter what the future will be, I think the kind of debate around climate change is now, bringing us in a position to say, okay, to be kind of protective, to react to climate change, to have a kind of human reaction to climate change, asking ourselves, that is really going to be possible? It's going to be like so, incredibly different from what is happening today. If the scenario 8.5 will happen, really, is that the kind of increase of temperature? And that could be applied to a series of other elements. And if we move into even, position or books or thoughts like Gaia Vince in Nomad Century, then how the climate change will impact on our cities, on our life, on the immigration of people. I mean, this book is very interesting because it's showing scenarios, which are the most extreme scenario, in which you might even look at a worldwide migration of billions of people from an area of the world to another area, moving north, more or less. So this poses a question, which is, okay, if that is going to happen, what about our cities? What about our current cities? What do we want to do with our cities? And here, the vertical landscape project, I think, is an interesting, case to ask ourselves a series of questions and try to articulate those questions through the lens of the climate change. And so the resilient approach to our design and how we can have a journey that is an adaptive journey. So this is about compact vertical city, is about the fact that we are going in height, but as Florian explained before, is not proposing a high density for the city. Is looking at where the density should happen. Is looking where we can transform what we have in a vertical landscape in order to do what? To understand if that can react better to, threats and hazards that are already hitting us, like heat waves and increase of temperature, as I said. How about flooding? How this concept reacts, this project can give better solutions to flooding. Is that about enhancing biodiversity for our cities? Is that about, through the openness, is bringing what? I'm not saying that everything is necessarily positive. It's just bringing us into a space in which we analyze how this concept can react to all these different components. What about water stress? What about the ability of this solution to give an answer, not just for in its own, but also for the surrounding areas? That this is also about energy security. It's about how this can deal with all the renewable solutions for itself again and for the neighborhood around. What are the possibilities? What are the possibilities to reduce carbon emissions per whatever, a number of population, number of citizens, square meters of, area. So all these different elements can be addressed, can be analyzed, and for sure, this project has a lot of answers to these different elements. If we move from resilience to another very, very critical point of our cities and society is how we can move from linear to circular. That's another very interesting question. It's about the complexity, it's about time, it's about what I said before about regenerative design. So I put this image of this very interesting and fascinating diagram, which is a diagram that comes from the 70s. H.T. Odum was an ecologist, an American ecologist. He wrote a book in the 1971 about environment, power, and society. And through the lens of the systemic approach to complex ecological ecosystems, he started thinking about what if we consider not only the environmental elements, but also our economic element, our societal elements, into patterns and workflows that are coming basically from energetics kind of patterns. And so you can see here, this might represent a city, might represent a district, might represent a region. In order to say, okay, what are the relationships between different entities? In his tentative, he tried to identify a parameter which was the energy, which is basically translating all these very complicated elements and processes into energy of the sun, right? So what make the Earth and ourselves living is the energy of the sun. So translating everything into energy of the sun, that is an incredible, okay, kind of, thought. The thing is that complexity, nowadays, as I said before, can be captured better with digital, can be captured in the future with other, digital and technological options, let's call it. So if we move from this very conceptual thing, then what does it mean from a design perspective for our cities, for our buildings, for a concept like the vertical landscape one? So we have to try to design for longevity. We have to try to design for adaptability. This is because of climate change, but it's also because we don't have enough resources. We know for humanity, a population that is increasing. And so I think that this is really telling us something interesting, because do we need to have a multi-layered approach? This is a typical, now is almost a classical image of how to look at a building, how to look at a project, how to look at a system in general. And if you look at a building, then you can have this onion skin through different layers in which each layer has a lifespan. So why approaching something that is made of different layers in the same way? So we must think about working in a way that, if you look at Vertical Landscapes project, I think it's in its own DNA already, this sort of approach, because as Andrew explained before, we've got a mega structure that is keeping together different elements and components of the project. So the mega structure itself, the large floor plate with all the social open amenities and functions, and then you got the units. You can have the dwelling units, you can have whatever, retail and other stuff. And also on top of it, you got the green infrastructure and the food infrastructure. So you are basically identifying a series of layers that have different purposes, different lifespan, and even different way in terms of business model, in terms of how you're going to manage these different layers. There will be different stakeholders and actors in the process. So by breaking down the overall concept into all these different components, I think the Vertical Landscapes introduces a new approach to what is, as Andrew said also before, this is not a building, this is a landscape that is creating a new concept for the city. So I think that in this way, as I said before, some of the challenges that we are facing might find some, answers into this project. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to Paolo and others for introducing. I'm going to speak very briefly about the lighting design process that we went through for the project. And framing up the process from some kind of broader principles, which are going to touch on a lot of the subjects that we've already talked on, particularly Paolo mentioning the sun, and that's kind of how we started our design process with Florian and the team. So we've looked at a very wide urban scale. I'm just going to talk very quickly on how individuals' experience have influenced this project, and how we can consider lighting design as really a health issue in the city. How well a city or a development is lit is a direct effect on our lives. The light, natural light, daylight and nighttime are critical for regulating our circadian rhythms. And so they directly influence our physical and mental state, how we experience light and the lit environment. We're increasingly comfortable with using this sort of tool or approach in building design and kind of development or development scale. But we'll less so talk about that at urban scale. And so we're interested in thinking about how that you can take those principles at an urban scale so that we can all enjoy the variation of daylight and the health benefits that it gives us. A quick trip back to high school on how we perceive our world. But the purpose of this slide is to talk about the eye-brain system, but also the non-visual aspects of the eye-brain system. And so we've known for, research has shown us for 100 years or so that we've got cells in our retinas that perceive light, but don't necessarily send visual signals back to our eye-brain system. And so this information goes to our pineal gland that then regulates a number of different hormones, including melatonin and others. So the point is that while a good lighting scheme, whether it's daylight or electric light, we can enjoy aesthetically, there is innate things happening which regulate our, as I said, our health and well-being through the non-visual signals that are being sent to our body. So in response to this, which is relevant to this project, but we've undertaken or we're developing some experimental metrics in how we think about light at an urban scale. So we're developing this idea of sunlight and daylight signatures as a new way of measuring and then assessing design criteria for a city scale. The idea being that when new cities are developed or conceived, we can think about not just the amount of daylight, but the quality of daylight, how much sky view, how much reflected light we might get within a city scale. So the images on the left are kind of at a development scale. The image on the right is looking at London, but this methodology through machine learning starts to categorize areas and then attribute different colors in this instance that talk about the different light characters or signatures that might be within a city. And I think there's a nice link here with the vertical landscapes about how we can quantify and consider how much light we'll experience in the city. The daylight design process was an intuitive, an integrated one, and we found out some interesting things. So as we worked with the team, we worked on the form and the function and the form of the more horizontal elements to splay them out to the sky as much as possible, and that gave us three things really. It gave us more light coming in because the form was splayed and had more of a letting more light in. We had better views of the sky, but also it gave us more ingress of direct sunlight through the structure as well through the year. The images on the right-hand side with some slices taken through that structure. The red area is showing that we're getting over 3,000 lux, which we would consider as being considered as a very well daylit space, even down towards the lower portions of the structure. So if we think about the circadian rhythm, we've talked in recent years more about daylight in our projects and getting good quality daylit effects within the projects, and we've talked less about the night. And of course, the circadian rhythm is based upon light and shade and how the body reacts to both a daylit effect and then nighttime, which allows the body to rest. And so the nighttime environment is equally important within a city to let our bodies rest, and also the environment, the broader environment, non-human environment to rest as well. Which then leads us from the individual to our communities. And what we've found in lighting cities for 100 years or so is that where we've landed is that cities are more inviting to some people than others. Our recent research here in Australia with Monash University in Melbourne looked at how women and girls, how subjectively safe they felt within cities, and then how the lighting conditions were influential on those. And it was some startling evidence that showed that we were excluding large parts of our community at night time, where women and girls did not feel included or welcome in parts of the city. And so to combat this, we've put metrics together and looked at the data, which has said that brighter doesn't always equal safer. And the evidence shows that good nighttime design, which we've touched on before about eyes on the street, nighttime stakeholders, I thought was a nice way based on what Christian had said earlier. Good design where the backdrop of an environment is lit, where people can see the way in and out of spaces, is much more important than creating brighter spaces, which tends to be what we've done over the last decades, where we've lit cities predominantly sometimes for cars more than people. The next aspect to consider is actually how the nighttime might change, how the lighting conditions might change through the nighttime. And so as our cities become less motorized and more dense, the activities within the cities are going to change and be more, the lighting is going to be required to change with them. And so we take an approach we consider called the shades of night, where city environments are able to adapt based on the functions within those spaces. And that's something that's used as a co-design process to understand the inhabitants of the space, and then matching that with technology so that using sensors or lighting that dims or changes color or changes tone can be matched to those functions. With the intent of making spaces more equitable, more inviting, and using less energy through their life. Another important aspect to the vertical landscape is lighting for biodiversity. So we've talked about the importance of biophilic design and recognizing the importance of green spaces in cities, something that my small experience of Tokyo, that Tokyo does well, but globally as well. But to get successful green spaces by day, we also need to understand how we're going to treat them at night. And this approach of understanding the nighttime ecology looks at non-humans as stakeholders within a project or an environment, where we look at the local flora and fauna, and where in some instances talk about biodiversity priority areas where we won't light spaces, or dim spaces down when humans are not around, so that we can encourage natural food chains to occur. We're not attracting animals and plants via bright light sources, which then attracts a chain of other events, which leads to an unhealthy environment. The benefit of this is also we get what we think is a more organic effect overall, and a better kind of urban texture at night time, where we avoid bland lighting of spaces, but whilst also attracting our non-human kin within the spaces. So how that translated into the final design, taking those elements into account. By day, we predict that the splayed structure on this section on the left here invites a lot more light within the space, daylight and sunlight. We think there's something really interesting about the suspended structures, where the view out of a suspended room or building will actually afford more views of lit floor than if it was on the floor and you'd be looking at a dark ceiling, which is pretty cool. The image on the right hand side is then starting to look at the other effects of the form, where we get good views of the sky and connection to the sky, which will then improve the overall general quality of the space, but also be allow us to be closer to our circadian rhythms and the natural cycles through letting that light in. And then final slide is how that translates to the nighttime. So at nighttime, think of the effects reversed. light will emanate from within the structure, and there'll be an interesting mix of private and public light, which reflects more towards the alleyways we discussed earlier, which were presented earlier, where you get variety and again a texture to the overall experience. By doing this, the overall environment will change as a streetscape, or a small kind of alleyway streetscape will change as the public and private light interacts. Circulation lighting around the spaces can then be human scale, whereby we're not lighting from above all the time. We're not casting kind of less attractive or inviting shadows around the environment, or done in such a way that we can understand the topography of a site rather than lit pathways through, which can lead to kind of less inviting spaces. And so, yeah, so the overall effect, we hope, is something that is inviting by nighttime, and then a healthy visual structure by day. Thank you very much.
So today I'm going to talk about urban farming in these vertical landscapes, which you've heard quite a bit about. And I love that I've heard so many basically themes about biodiversity and also managing complexity in the system. And hopefully you'll see our idea around how we can manage farming and the complexity of urban farming. I feel very privileged to be speaking amongst all these credentialed architects and engineers and professors. My background is primarily in agriculture and plant molecular biology, but in the past couple of years, my focus has been on artificial intelligence. And I'm really interested in the intersections of AI and agriculture and also gender. I work as a researcher at Braid, and our vision is to automate engineering design across several industries, including architecture. So in Henry Lefebvre's work in 1970, he describes the dimensions and levels help to establish distinct codes, either juxtaposed or superimposed, for decrypting the message, the urban phenomenon considered as message. And these dimensions, he's referring to, are abstract, both global, local, and private powers, but he's also referring to more literal spatial dimensions. And throughout this work, he just argues that these dimensions are key for understanding and uncovering this urban phenomenon. And while I'm neither a philosopher nor an architect, this quote inspired me to think about what are the dimensions and levels of our modern agricultural system. And by and large, I would say that our modern food system and modern agricultural system is quite two-dimensional. And fundamentally, consumers and growers are separated in both space and in society. Vast swaths of land are required to produce food, which tends to travel quite far to urban consumers. And to make this work as efficiently as possible, we tend to rely on monocultures, where we have a single crop that is dominating a once diverse agro ecosystem. And it should be no surprise that typically, to make this system work, it requires a lot of mechanical and chemical pruning to keep it in order. Of course, that's not the only farming system. I grew up on a small organic farm in Midwestern United States, and my father's motto was to work with nature, not despite it. And every year he would spend quite a bit of time thinking about how in our 80-acre farm, how he would basically arrange crops and to basically consider how we would manage soil health, minimize pest pressures. And together we would manage a lot of these fields by hand. And it's a lot of labor. And unfortunately, even though it might be more environmentally sustainable, it's labor intensive and very difficult to scale such a system. So we want to consider whether or not there's an alternative or something that helps us bridge this gap. And as you've heard today, vertical landscapes potentially offer a new paradigm for urban living. Can they offer a new paradigm for urban farming as well? Perhaps a better one. Do vertical landscapes therefore unlock a new dimension for urban farming? Together with FBA, Braid and I were trying to imagine what urban farming would look like in these vertical landscapes. Specifically, we wanted to leverage the unique terrain and microclimate gradients that you would see throughout the vertical landscapes. And again, bringing people closer to their food system, but still having the level of automation required to feed communities at scale. And so our solution to this is voxel farming. In computer graphics, voxels are three-dimensional pixels. In vertical landscapes, voxels are 3D spaces, slightly less than a cubic meter in size, where each cube or voxel represents a single area where a single crop would be grown. Each of these voxels will be arranged amongst other voxels, both in horizontal and in vertical. And this allows for very strategic intermingling of different plant species. So these voxel fields are dynamic, three-dimensional agricultural fields that with our technology, we can optimize them for resource creation, resource consumption, nutrition, and even well-being of the residents of the vertical landscapes. So of course, when we're trying to optimize a field, there are many, many factors to consider. Today, I want to focus on one dimension primarily, and that's crop complementarity. And as the name suggests, it's describing how two plant species could exist in proximity to one another. This relationship can be positive, neutral, or negative, depending on the plant species morphology, their diseases and pests, as potentially even the chemicals that they release to communicate with one another. So for example, strawberries and tomatoes might make pretty good neighbors because their difference in the canopy, their height difference, actually allows for more natural sunlight to permeate into the voxel fields. On the other hand, bell peppers or paprika here in Japan and tomatoes might not be very good neighbors because they have many of the same pests and diseases. And so if we can, we should try to keep them separated in space and time. So with our technology, we hope that we can encode this knowledge of crop complementarity to optimize the voxel field layout. So what you're seeing is the underlying algorithm at work. It's basically computing the crop complementarity score and making a decision as to whether or not a certain voxel should stay where it is, and if it should be relocated, where it should be relocated in the field. So you can start to see some patterns or some relationships between species emerging, where each of these colors represents a different crop. And so using this technology, we can optimize voxel fields that outperform traditional monocultures. On the left column, you have a monoculture. So this is what most of us are familiar with. This is where we plant crops in rows, in this case, voxels in rows. And the only interaction between neighboring crops is at those borders. In the center column, we have a completely randomized distribution of voxels. And on the right column, we have a braid optimized voxel field. Keep in mind that these particular selection and distribution of crops makes sense for maybe a particular, let's say, layer or level of the vertical farm at a particular season in Tokyo, but this would be fine-tuned for a specific scenario. In the lower level, we see a heat map, and the heat map is showing us the degree of crop complementarity. So the more green a voxel is, the higher the crop complementarity, and that's a good thing. Crop complementarity, the main benefit would be higher potential yield, but there are other benefits as well. And that would be hopefully reducing pest pressure, therefore hopefully less chemicals we would need to use, and also making the field more friendly for our non-human residents, such as pollinators. So hopefully you can see on this heat map that the optimized fields has a greater crop complementarity. Of course, crop complementarity is just one small thing that we might consider when we're optimizing. we should also take into consideration the microclimate changes along the tower. So the crops that you would grow at the bottom of the structure would be quite different than the ones you might grow near the top, based on the differentials in temperature, elevation, and wind. All would affect, not to mention sunlight, which Tim did a great job of explaining. Interestingly and importantly, the vertical landscape itself provides a mean for renewable energy and resource capture. So for example, there's a great advantage of capturing wind near the top of the vertical landscapes, and that could provide renewable energy required to power these voxel farms. Additionally, we'd like to hope that we can actually capture rainwater and leverage the gravitational flow along these vertical landscapes to provide some irrigation in a more sustainable and, let's say, approaching something close to circular to support these voxel farms. Crucially, I want to point out that these voxel fields are not operating in isolation. They communicate with one another, and they communicate with the residents of the vertical landscapes as well. They are dynamic, and they are intelligent systems that are helping to manage the complexity that is required to produce food for a community that is growing in these vertical landscapes. So currently in Tokyo, fewer than 10,000 people are engaged in any kind of agriculture for more than 60 days a year. And that probably isn't surprising because urban farming is not feasible for most of us. It's very difficult to imagine taking time out of our day or out of our lives to produce food in any meaningful volume. I argue that these voxel fields within a vertical landscape will empower residents to play a more active role in their food system, because these fields have a much, let's say, greater proportional impact, not just on the food that's produced and the nutrition it provides for you, but also your surrounding agro-ecosystem. You're incentivized to care and to play a greater role in your food system. So vertical landscapes, if they are to be built in Tokyo, I think will be a crucial part of the urban agricultural revolution. And I hope that you can see that automation is really key for managing these complexity, but also bringing us closer to our food system. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dario Trabucco. I haven't not worked on the project Vertical Landscapes, so I'm not going to use any of the slides that you used already. I'm actually not going to use any slide at all because I have the privilege to come last in the sequence today of the speakers. So I wanted to take advantage of this position to try to connect some of the dots and put together some ideas from what the previous speakers have been referring to. And I want to start from one of the pictures that Florian was showing with the different energy consumption and CO2 emissions of households in different cities. The idea of the slides that Florian was showing was to highlight how density is a positive factor. And in fact, the blue lower intensities of energy were in the downtown, more dense areas of Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and so on, while the other more agricultural, less dense environments were characterized by a much higher energy consumption per capita and per household. A few years ago, CTBUH, the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, the organization I collaborate with, created a different study on the difference between low-rise, low-density neighborhoods and high-rise, high-density neighborhoods in one specific city in Chicago. The study was aimed at understanding if high density really means low consumption. But the research that was done back then went a little bit farther in comparing not just the lifestyle of the people, but also the buildings, the families of Folk Park in Chicago and the families of a high-rise residential building in downtown Chicago were living. And the result was quite disappointing from our point of view, because the high-density building, so the apartment that the household was using in a high-density building, was actually built using much more concrete, much more steel, more chemical products, more polluting building materials than the low-rise equivalent. And consequently, during the life cycle of the family, the balance was pretty much the same. So density, yes, is positive, but the way we decline density through verticality can actually be a little bit more challenging. The presentation, the ideas that I'm going to share with you today, I'm going to be titled Social and Environmental Challenges of Verticality, because I think that verticality is probably one of the points. Verticality doesn't necessarily mean density. We saw many examples today of vertical cities that are not dense. But I think that when Joachim showed the very dense clusters in Hong Kong or in Shanghai, or if we think about the European equivalent of those with the residential blocks built in the Soviet countries back in the 50s and the 60s, from a Westerner perspective, we think that that is not a good quality of living. It's not a good quality of building. We would not like to live in one of those beehives that populate most of the Asian cities. But the problem is that the way that we think about density, all the projects that we, most of the projects that we see at CTBUH, but also those that are being built around cities in North America, in Europe, in Australia, somewhere also, of course, in the Middle East, but also in many cities in Asia, are high-rise buildings, but are not dense buildings, because are not built for normal people, but are built for the ultra-rich people. They're not built for normal companies, but are for the super-rich companies. And unfortunately, no one this morning spoke about what I think is the main aspect of verticality, which is embodied carbon. Actually, luckily, no one spoke about it, because I think it's one of the main drivers of the future construction of vertical/dense cities. What is embodied carbon? Just to recap for those that are not familiar with the topic, embodied carbon or embodied energies is the amount of energy or the equivalent CO2 emissions that were due to the production of the materials, that were due to the construction process, the transportation of these materials, and at the end of the life cycle of the building will be used for the demolition of the building and the disposals of the materials. And of course, when we need more materials, we need more energy to extract them, to transform them, to transport them, and so on. So the question is verticality the good answer for this? And because if we need to build something vertical, as we saw during the presentation from the colleagues from Europe, we need more structural elements, we need deeper foundations, we need many more muscular buildings. So the question is, can we achieve a different level of density and a different level of verticality? And probably the answer is yes. Those buildings that we disdain those buildings where we don't want to live that are built in Hong Kong and in many other cities. So the responsibility is, I think, on the architect. And the title of these few words that I want to say today can be probably renamed with social and environmental challenges of architecture, or of the architect that is designing this building. Because the architect is the creator of the main shape of this building, of the concept of this shape, but is also the one person that dialogues more often with the client, with the developer, or with the family that want to build this house, or with the unskilled parties that come together when the construction of a building starts. So where is the responsibility of the architect here? Because we are seeing, again, especially in the Western world, buildings that are over-designed. Because the clients want to be over-designed, but because also we want to over-design our buildings. Of course, architectural firms, engineering firms have to bring projects, have to develop a lot of built area in order to be able to support themselves and so on. But the question that we need to ask is, where is the limit of such development? Before coming here this morning, I was looking at a low-rise building, the headquarters of Booking.com in Amsterdam, designed by UN Studio, which is absolutely a beautiful building from many points of view. But the amount of materials that a 55-meter tall building, so not really a tall building, but also not a very low-rise building, the amount of materials that the building required to be built is quite enormous. And what is the reason for this? Because of the design that the architect chose to implement for it, with a 25-meter-long cantilever, with a very open attic on the low level, a very low open basement at the low level that requested composite mega columns with a tree-branched shape. So the question is, do we as architects need to always reply positively to this request, or to push our design limits wherever we can? Because now we can do many stuff because of computers, thanks to artificial intelligence, thanks to the construction capabilities of construction companies and so on. Or should we start to acknowledge the fact that we are going a little bit too far? Again, connecting with embodied carbon. France is probably on the cutting edge of the limitation of the possibilities to use materials and to use energy for the construction of buildings. There is a carbon cap being implemented in France that is going to be reduced in the upcoming years. And this will actually limit the architectural possibilities and the structural possibilities of our buildings. If we have a certain amount of embodied carbon or of embodied energy that can go into a building, no matter how rich or how wealthy the organization that we are building for the building is, this will limit the amount of steel. This will limit the amount of concrete that can go into the building. This will limit the amount of glass that will go into the building. So the responsibilities of us as designers, architects, engineers, are probably to acknowledge the fact that the way that we designed in the past and that we are designing buildings, and we're still designing buildings today, is not compatible anymore with the increasing population that Florian was describing us. It's not compatible with the fact that many places will be inhabitable in a short amount of time due to the increased sea level, due to the global warming, due to climate change in general. And I think that the building where we are today is a pretty good example of this. We are in a building that was built several hundred years ago, that was probably designed to be an apartment. We're now going to have a conference, but at the same time, it also operates as an office. So the adaptability of the building is probably the most important aspect of it all. And I think that most of the design aspect that we saw in vertical landscape can offer this, can be a hint for adaptability. It's now a vertical garden, but can be transformed into something different, into something that will have a different function in the future. I'm going to conclude these few words again, stressing on the importance and on the responsibility of what the building industry is doing, and especially what the architects are doing, because the architects are the connection point between the non-skilled actors of the building process, the clients, whatever it's a company or a family or an individual, and the people that is providing the right answers to the need of building something. And it's a very important responsibility that no computer, no AI tool will be able to fulfill, not now, but also not in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dario. Very worthwhile comments. Very enjoyed it. And thank you to everybody who gave these really, really interesting presentations. And I think what we could see is the tremendous amount of complexity that goes into architecture or the actual architectural process. I want to apologize. I didn't mention that two of our speakers, Andrew and Tim, are actually in Sydney, so they're 10 hours ahead of Venice, 2 hours ahead of Tokyo, so it's getting quite late. But after this, I'm going to give a few more. I'm going to show a few more slides, greatly in response, hopefully a little bit response to what you said, Dario. But after that, we will have the idea is to have a short panel discussion where everybody will join. So here in Venice, in Tokyo, and in Sydney. And if there are any questions from the audience, we're very much looking forward to addressing these. I want to conclude, or maybe it's not a conclusion, it's an in conclusion, but I want to say some more words about summing up what we have seen so far. And the title is Urban Revolution with the R in parentheses. And I think that evolution is maybe stronger than revolution. It's definitely longer lasting. It can definitely achieve much more. Elizabeth was also already quoting Henri Lefebvre, who, and I think it might be 1970 or 1968, whatever, but this book that he published around that time is Urban Revolution. And it tries to overcome or blur the boundaries between the rural and the distinction between the rural and the urban. And he says, he keep in that book, he makes a lot of arguments, but one of them is that we have to overcome this. We have to get rid of this thinking that the urban and the rural are two separate things. Today, the urban phenomenon astonishes us by its scale. Its complexity surpasses the tools of our understanding. And there is already a hint at what Paolo, you were mentioning, the post-anthropocentrism, that we are just one part, we humans are just one part of a much larger system. And crucial to understand what we've been trying to, or what we've been seeing today, about our process of this project is that the project Vertical Landscapes are not interested in preconceived form, but it's an evolutionary process and the flexibility to adapt that comes with it. And that was Dario was mentioning, the flexibility to adapt to future uses that we don't even know yet. What we do know is that we will change, society will change. So, if anything, it's more logical to have an evolution than a revolution. And what I do want to stress, though, is that this is a highly complex system, as you could see. But the only way that we humans can kind of, set the stage for such a complex system is that we understand that we understand that the result has to be complex if you want to talk about an urban context. It cannot be simplicity, which I think a lot of the architecture that we are seeing, the buildings that we are seeing are very simplistic. And that, on the other hand, the spatial complexity and the social and the environmental complexity needs to be addressed on a system that is based on simple principles. And I want to just mention a few of them, which I think are quite fascinating. That what you look at is based on a few simple geometric rules. So we slice the surface, we continue to stitch it together, and then move it up, and you see that the result is a continuous surface. And they lead to, this concept leads to several possible types, and we have always looked at the one on the left now, but there are other types which you can imagine that follow the same principle, which can, in return, really respond to specific conditions on site, on culture, on environment, etc. So cutting through them shows that they all share one thing, and that's their continuous surface. So this is different types. As you go through, you see that you can always imagine that you can walk them. They are walkable. And we've discussed it that, we've seen it in the discussions that walkability is a fundamental asset of an urban environment that we need to embrace. And changing just a few of the base parameters of this yields a wide spectrum of types. And this gives a flexibility to respond to specific criteria of any site that you might be facing. So if you just see, and in the end you have like a catalog of a large potential typology. And what is really important that we understand, we have a continuous variation. So you could see that there are small ones, there are large ones, tall, more footprint, less footprint, different distances between the slabs, etc. And instead of preconceived form, vertical landscapes evolve in feedback processes. We've seen these gradients which respond to the ground conditions, annual direct sunlight hours. It's a constellations which is tuned to respond and then reanalyzed and so on. You see, it's a feedback process where you have you get an optimized result in the end. So it is all about performance, right? And this is, for example, daily sunlight hours, which if you use them for planting, you could see that you see some plants that need more shade, less shade, etc., which probably would be a part of the system, the optimizing system that Elizabeth was introducing. Of course, if you think about this continuous surface, you can see that we can have very, very simple, well-working water cycles. You just need to use gravity in a clever way, and then we could have wetlands throughout. We could, use the gravity to make this a holistic system. We saw this, that we have microclimates depending on how high you are. It drastically changes. So all in all, as I said before, we're not talking about a building, we are talking about built environment, and it is sort of a hybrid organism. And it's not top-down imposed. It's not a master plan. It's actually a ground for bottom-up evolution. And with this comes the potential of having an artificial ground for a diversity where we humans are just one part, and that's what we talked about. So we are beyond the idea that the humans are in the center of the universe. And with this, we will be able to create a tremendous amount of resilience. And I think this is very, very crucial in understanding how to go forward. This diversity also brings, and the key aspect which I think defines urban life or the city, the urban conditions, in fact, the essence of that is interaction. And the vessel for all urban interaction is, I think, are these places where you encounter streets, parks, these open places that are open to anybody. And therefore, I think it's really important to point out how we envisage you would circulate on these vertical landscapes. It's very barely visible, I apologize, but you can see that because we have a continuous surface, and it's a built-in redundancy, you can really find different ways up. It's no longer the idea that the elevator does everything. But what happens is that what you can see is you get a multitude of possible ways to navigate, to move through the city. And with that, myriad ways of unexpected encounters, which will become part of everyday life. So if you think about the high-rise, where the only place where you actually bump into people is the place where you don't want to meet anybody, and that's the elevator, the dark elevator. Here is the complete opposite. You always, your navigation is like it should be it is in the rest of the city, and that's in the open. So we made a little booklet, and it shows the structure, but it shows it as a series of plans, and you see how there's no word in this book, but you see how you could imagine how this could be occupied. We are not designing necessarily the small parts of the small building parts for that. And just to give you an idea, so we have one surface. In this case, it was 26 plates, and from below and from above is how the book is laid out. So on the left, you'd look up, and on the right, you see a more conventional floor plan, and you see all sorts of things. This snake here is the idea that there might be a slide where you hop on and you slide down. There might be on the top right, this might be some kind of event space like we are doing now. And on the top left, this might actually be something that Elizabeth was saying, like a voxel farming. But the important thing is that it's always continuous. As you can see in the center here, people are able to walk or to use an e-bike or an e-scooter or a normal bike, whatever. It's all accessible and continuous. So this is the basic idea of how we could envisage that the city is really growing into the vertical. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to a panel discussion in a couple of minutes. Thanks to all the presenters. It was really fantastic. Before I open the floor to audience questions, I have my own questions, and I think that several of the speakers have questions to each other. And I would like to start with a question, actually, where I see Dario and Andrew fighting it out. You mentioned embodied carbon. And I think one of the crucial aspects that that we are trying to say is here that we are really minimizing the amount of material that goes into multiplying the ground, right? Of course, I mean, we are not, as I said many times, we are not proposing a building. So there will be other aspects of, these suspended units, other infrastructural part that will come, other structures on top of these surfaces. And I think they all have a much more temporary nature than what we would, especially in a context like Venice, what we would think a normal building has. I mean, one side note, and Joachim mentioned that the average lifetime of a small house in Tokyo is 27 years. So, yeah, it's a completely different mindset, right? If you are to follow some stereotypes, if you're a father in Tokyo, you don't think that you would impose a building on the future generations, right? It's not like I'm building a house and my grandchildren and their grandchildren are going to live in this. No, on the contrary, it's much like how can I even have the audacity to think I know what my children or my grandchildren will be, what kind of world they will be in, and what is technological possible at that time. So I would like to, first of all, ask Andrew maybe to expand a little bit on how we limit or minimize the material effort in general for the overall structure, and then maybe Dario to come to these points that are really, really great and important. And I think when you pointed the finger at us architects in terms of having to push back, clients who not necessarily mean bad, but they don't know any better. And I think I would like to so first of all about the structural infrastructure of the vertical landscapes, but then also the kind of the flimsiness that could happen with anything that gets attached to these, i.e. mostly those suspended units, etc. Right.
Shall we start with?
Yeah, Andrew, do you want to jump in, Andrew?
Yeah, I can start. I think it's Dario. I think it's great that you challenged us on that immediately, and perhaps we didn't focus on that sort of as embodied carbon as a word in the presentations. I kind of did stay away from that on purpose in a way, because I knew we could talk about it for days upon end. But what I wanted to try and stress, and perhaps that wasn't so clear in my discussion though, was that the certainly in the way we developed the structure here, that embodied carbon is, and its reduction, its measurement and how we improve it is inherent in some of the decisions we make around the form, of course, initially, and making sure we have, dematerialization has to come first. Of course, we are building something, so building nothing is, of course, the best, and reuse and adaptation of what we have. But in here, we're talking about something that needs to be built, so we must dematerialize it to start with. And as a structural engineer, that comes from the form. And if we have elements that are doing multiple functions, the fundamentals are sound. The things that we focus on first, of course, selection, materiality, and we can go deep into how we select materials to use, for a certain form, and using future technologies, using materials, whether it be timber or others, and how we use those materials. And of course, then we move on to flexibility and adaptation, and that canvas that Florian just spoke about for future adaptation, uses that we don't even know exist at the moment in a building like this. So I think we certainly have scratched the surface of how we would do that here. And of course, not a structure or a day goes by now where we are not looking at that on any building. Some that we talked about recently, the work that we've been doing down here on regeneration of the existing buildings in particular, and stock in mature cities, and how we reuse those is of course on our tongue every day. So look, without getting off the topic, I think there is much that we have done. There is more that we can do with this vertical landscape to make sure that embodied carbon is there at the forefront. But I have to, it is something that we have been mindful of throughout. Of course, we can't not be in talking about this type of regenerative and future design.
Thank you, Andrew. Florian was asking earlier on whether what is the right solution between those that are building very simple apartments, houses, buildings in general, or the tendency that there is, especially in some countries, to over-design, for instance, the thermal insulation. Again, that's a balance that needs to be carried out through the life cycle of the building, taking into account all the different factors. We tend to over-consider the winter energy consumption, but at the moment with global warming and climate change, the summer time energy consumption is becoming more and more important. I think that the problems of embedded carbon always goes down to what makes sense in terms of architecture. Do we need a 20-meter lease span for a building if then it's going to be used for an apartment where we have smaller bedrooms, smaller living rooms, and so on? Do we need to have a building that is tilting just because the architect wanted the building to be inclined this way, or projecting or cantilevering out that many floors? And I think that really what, not just France, as I was mentioning during my presentation, but also Finland, the Netherlands, Denmark are doing, is to impose a cap. So you cannot build a building that needs more than 800 kilograms of CO2 per square meter. Now, this is a number that we don't have the perception of the magnitude. How much is 800 kilograms of CO2? But it's basically changing the way buildings are being designed and built. Some things cannot be done anymore. It's not acceptable, and it's not even sexy anymore to do something that uses more than what will be needed. And also from the point of view of the user, I think it's very important to make compromises. Again, we're in a building that is not optimized to be a conference room, but we're doing a nice conference anyway. It was not designed to be an office building, but they have a beautiful view on the Grand Canal, so it's a very nice building. I think the interaction with the user is fundamental. And to pass maybe the ball on to Paolo, I think that the fact that MEP systems are now designed to keep 24 degrees 365 days a year is wrong. We need to wear a heavier coat during the winter, and we need maybe to have a t-shirt and not to wear a tie and a jacket anymore during the summertime, because it's not acceptable anymore. When these concepts came into place, there were only maybe 100 million people on the world that could afford it. Now there are 2.5 billion. It will be 7 billion very soon that can afford to have air conditioning or to have 24 degrees in the house. It's not acceptable. There's not enough energy to do that.
If we can jump on this, I mean, these are very important points. Thanks, Dario. And if I can just touch I think exactly as you are saying, and you said, I mean, that's a process. And that's a process that is going on and is going faster and faster, as you said, in Northern Europe, in the UK. But even in Italy, the debate is active, and some projects already are targeting very challenging, carbon performance. The point, I think, for this specific project is really trying to understand how much you can, optimize the, let's say, the LCA performance, so the whole life cycle of the building.
So that is a very important point. So extending the performance of carbon up to the end of life, after the end of life, then this leads us into the circularity, area, space. And when you get into circularity, the game is becoming even more complex, right? I mean, you can make a calculation, you can optimize the building, and you can decide to, as you exactly said, I agree, is defining a cap, is defining a carbon budget, is defining a carbon rating, very similar to what happened and it's happening for energy, in order to, build in a different way, having the whole supply chain and the all stakeholders involved in this, journey. But the point to me is very important in this concept is, beside LCA, circularity. So how we can activate a model that, as I said before, is looking forward to the future. How we can future-proof our city. That was the title of my presentation, because I think also cities, buildings, environments, built environment, this is about reducing the embodied carbon, but also is about to implement new way of conceiving buildings and the built environment. And the two together can reach the best result. And so, just to explain myself in a better way, don't take me wrong, if you extend the life cycle of an asset, eventually, you can even increase the embodied carbon that you put in that. You know what I mean? I mean, I'm not saying nothing different, not from what you said, but what if I put at the very beginning more embodied carbon eventually, but that buildings last longer, is more adaptable, has more flexibility. And that leads to the fact that if we focus on else, energy is there, right, Dario? Then there is embodied carbon, which is super important and very actual now. But looking at all the other, a consumption, the metabolistic view, like of Odum, is like, okay, how does the vertical landscapes work? It's a piece of a city. And in that piece of the city, you've got an input and you've got an output. And then how you can make within this scheme circularity working. So reduce the input, reduce the output, and keep everything within that system. That's an interesting challenge. And so this also brings into the conversation, Elizabeth, food, green, nature, economics. It's all in there. So I think, expanding from all these different components into the creation of a circularity model for the project, I think that is very crucial.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Elizabeth, your name was dropped, so you'll be addressed shortly. One thing I think that we also need to put on the table is embodied carbon or energy that it takes to build. But I think we have potentially a paradigm shift towards making a structure produce much more energy than what we've ever known before, because of the way the surfaces can be optimized to harvest, let's say, solar, because of the potential for wind, depending on where they are, how they are, how the specific response in terms of the geometry is. And I think, and that's where I would like to hand the baton over to Elizabeth, is also, in terms of production of food, for example, it could be on as Elizabeth said, it could become part of everyday life for humans, which I think is really, really important. But B, it could be in terms of urban farming on a scale that is so not doesn't exist to my knowledge at this point. Whilst at the same time being enjoyable. I don't know, Elizabeth, do you have something to respond to?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me. So I think if we look at what urban agriculture looks like today, we have kind of quaint, if I can use that term, sort of community farms where we have maybe small plots of land where we can enjoy this almost as a hobby. On the other hand, we have things like vertical farms. There are several large companies that are doing this in cities like New York. where we have these really large, let's say, kind of isolated greenhouses that allow very little natural light inside. And they're very efficient, but they're nutritionally rather vapid. They provide things just like microgreens. And so what we were trying to think of when we were thinking of these vertical landscapes is how can we find something that is, community driven, and sort of managing these complexities and these trade-offs. There is no single silver bullet, as you said. We think that voxel farming is a good solution, and makes sense in terms of providing these ecosystem services for and from urban agriculture. So having these, let's say, polycultures grown, hopefully makes it more sustainable, both in terms of the resources that would be inputted to the system, but also provides greater output, not just sheer volume of food, but nutritional value. So yes, I think it is very complicated to pin down a particular single solution, but I think that voxel farming is potentially one piece of the puzzle in this very complex, maybe circular system in the vertical landscapes.
Yeah, thank you. I think what I've found very interesting over the many years that these vertical landscapes have been, in my mind, and especially the past year when we have been developing them together with all the people that you could see today, is that it's in a way the way it should be, that the social aspect of building something, of designing something, and the technical aspect are two sides of the same coin, and they are completely linked. And you can extend that to the way that these landscapes would be inhabited and occupied. And as I think we've seen several times today, that they are an intrinsic part of the urban environment, and I think that's the key issue to understand, and I hope that we'll get to see them built in the not so long future. Which brings me to another aspect that wasn't really mentioned, but I think, Andrew, you mentioned it quickly, but technologically we could start building tomorrow. We are not saying we need to have this new material and we need to have that technology that has not been invented yet. We could, theoretically, we could start building. What's in our way now is the mindset of people. And when I say mindset of people, it's that we need politicians on our side. We need several building laws that have not been written yet in that form, that need to be able to embrace the opportunities that we see here.
Is it working? Yes. Okay. Thanks. At this point about really making this project viable. So this is what you're talking about from different points of view. So policymakers, codes, compliance, and also say, economic sustainability, which is one of the aspects that probably we didn't touch, but it's very, very important, because we touched probably all the wide spectrum of sustainability. And I think in some of the presentations, some that every one of us has told, and I would go back again to Elizabeth. I think Elizabeth is a presentation about this voxel farming. I see that urban farming is a quite intriguing and fascinating topic. But then it can be articulated in many different ways. You can have super climate controlled farming, not like vertical farming within a box. Here we're talking about something different. We are talking about bringing food into a city. And one of the things is that if you like looking at numbers, right? I mean, if we start looking at numbers, numbers are meaningful in telling you more like, so if we look at, okay, can we make urban farming, effective for cities? If you calculate how much, of course you can do this, and there are examples. In Northern Europe, again, there are many examples. So there is a push, which is because, again, it's not just about food, it's not just about, social aspect, it's also about climate resilience. It's also about making green roofs from gray or brown roofs and so on. So the thing is that when we look at the concept of the voxel farming, that is, again, as you said, multiplying the layers. It means multiplying the effects, the outcomes. And so I think there are many, many aspects of it that should be pushed in terms of, dialogue with the political policymakers, finance and financial institutions and developers, in order to say, okay, look, there are a series of advantages by adopting these elements which span really across the different elements of E and S. So if we talk about ESG, then the environmental of the E and the social of the S, there are so many elements that they are embedded into the Vertical Landscapes project that have to be evaluated and that have to be shown as advantages for many stakeholders in this process. And there's also the G, so the governance. What is the governance? The model of governance for a new, a element of the city, as you said many, many times, and it's visible, I think, to everyone. This is not a building. This is not a master plan. This is something new. And so when you got something new, then you have to have also a new governance model to make it work. So I think that there are so many, advantages to be analyzed and detailed further throughout the different components of ESG that really, could mean we could discover more and more, right? I mean, in terms of how this can be, put in place.
Yeah, completely agree with this. And this is also something where the cultural context is going to be the main driver. Yeah, this could work here, but it doesn't work there, etc. But I think when I talked about urban revolution with the R in the parentheses, I think that for me that the structural part that we showed is I'm much more interested in the evolutionary process and in the continuity, both from the past and all the way into a future that is unknowable to us. But I think that a little bit of a revolution has to happen in our mindsets. And as we all know, unfortunately, human beings are very, very short-sighted. You cannot convince people to think beyond a certain time, right? And what happens when you work with developers is also a lot of times that the short-term ROI is all that is important, right? But I do sense that there's also already something happening, that when you look at a more long-term or mid-term to long-term ROI, is all of a sudden, people become more important, and that's not only because everybody loves their fellow human beings, but just again it goes back to numbers. If I, as somebody puts in money, notice that by investing this and this and this, the people will be healthier or will be more efficient, a different sense of efficiency. It's very dry, but this is also part of the equation. Then all of a sudden, such things that we are proposing now might make more sense. Yeah.
If I can, sorry to jump into it a bit on, I don't want to take time to others, but I think that some of the elements that you showed even before, like a new public and private relationship, not through this. So when we say, okay, there's a new public and private relationship, then it comes exactly to what you said. So how we can develop a new model, and also from an economic and financial standpoint, if you put public and private, you can't keep thinking just about cost and benefit in a traditional way. So what are the costs what are the avoided costs that you put into the equation, right? I mean, and looking at flooding, looking at climate change, looking at the value of the people that are affected by the heat waves, people that are dying more and more during summertime. So how do you take into the balance, cost-benefit balance, all these different elements? This is because it's not just a private project, it's not a public project, but what's the nature of the project? If it's public and private, then you have to make, you know, a new model also in terms of cost and benefit analysis. Just to give you some numbers, I mean, in Europe, the cost of climate change for extreme events is 50 billions per year. It was 20, it was 12, like if you go back 10 years ago, it was 20, you know, something like that. And now it's 50 billions. And 3 countries, France, Germany, and Italy, counts for half of this. So 25, you know, billions per year. So this is what we are talking about. I mean, we have to take into account this.
Yes, we have a question from the audience here in Tokyo.
I'm not an expert on this, but I just wanted to ask on this ownership of this project question, like, because it's like, I mean, you started with this image of the small house, no? So, and like you put it together in a major structure, and when you look, when you pick these thoughts, or when you look at the parcel structure of Tokyo, I'm not an expert on this, but at least it like represents this very fragmented, small, tiny parcels, and on the other hand side, what's coming up, more this accumulation into bigger ownership parcels, and that kind of represents also that, I mean, what Piketty says in this in his books, like this divergence of social structure, like you have this fragmented small owners, and this, it's kind of vanishing, and it's more accumulating into this big ownership. So when you create these new structures, and is it in a way for a city space just creating more big ownerships, like who owns this house at the end? Like what? So is it like, I mean, is it like a community model, or is it like the government provides the structure, or is it like an investor who provides it? Like personally, for me, the magic of these cities now is always in a way it's maybe more a social question, but this balance of powers. Like you have a wide spread of owners that create this space. So with a huge diversity of living models. So and this is a bit the questions when you create these big structures, like who has the power in these structures, and finally who is the owner, and this would be a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is an extremely relevant and important question. And the short answer is that I don't have an answer. I don't have one answer. I think there are several possible scenarios for this, and the reason is that we have never done it. Yeah? But I would like to go back to the idea that you know what I laid out in the beginning, that we are multiplying the urban ground. So what's the ownership of ground? And I think it's extremely important to envisage ownership of private, small private entities like families or individuals, rather than having all of it owned by corporate space, where we get this, what I said is the pseudo-public space that is no longer truly public. And ownership also in small units will ensure a much healthier social environment, because people start to take care of their environment better. Now, that being said, you know, if you think about how the city is today, we have like streets, right, and parks that are owned by, it could be owned privately, but mostly they're still owned by the municipality, and we have individual lots, right, that are often owned by individuals. And what Joachim was showing, that in Tokyo, to use an example where it works really, really well, it's interesting that you have these extremely small lots. There's a lot 60 square meters, and this is where you have your house, and you get these extremely well taken care of neighborhoods. And if we multiply this situation in the vertical, what will happen? Now we are going to have some issues that we don't have with the ground, i.e., who takes care of the, let's say, the vertical structure as it is, who's doing the maintenance. But I think there are analogies that you could have from how the municipality takes care of this. I think what you mentioned earlier to me, about the example of Milan, where private developers develop something, but then the basic infrastructure like roads is given, the responsibility is given back to the city, etc. I mean, it really depends on the cultural context. But the idea, just to go back once more, is that you would say, okay, we have these structures, and you as an individual can purchase or lease. I think there's also the idea of having a leasehold of something like this for an undefined period. Like in Tokyo, or in Japan, it's often like between 20 and 50 years that you can lease a land and then you build something. In the UK, there's long-term leasehold for 999 years, as you probably know. So it could be a different model, but that you own or lease something and that is yours, and then by that time you become a positive part of the communities, I think. And what happens to the top of these surfaces, again, if they are used for voxel farming, these areas would be probably on a lease. If they are used for events like, let's say, a university wants to rent a space where they have a temporary campus or something, that probably would be on a lease. So I think there are viable ways to make this, and there must be, to make this financially possible. Because otherwise, I mean, I don't think anybody here is so naive to think that we can build, we can multiply the urban ground and make 26 times a park landscape. That would be nice, but I think that's not what we're after here. I think it's really important to increase the density for people to live and to work, and at the same time to establish the sense of community that will hold this thing together.
I would like to add something, which is that even if you have a big apartment tower, the ownership can be split, so you can own an apartment in a big apartment tower, but the nature of that ownership is very different from owning a piece of land where you build your little house, because if you buy the land instead of an apartment, you're completely free to build on it what you want. It doesn't need to be a house, and you can change it in the future. You can completely adapt it to your needs, but also you are not bound to an outside authority which is gonna be able to decide which is going to have control basically over the access to your property. So I think this is something completely new, that we can have this reclaimed freedom and independence, but still have it in the vertical dimension.
Are there any questions in Tokyo? Or Christian, did you want to add something? Do you have a thought on this idea of ownership?
Okay, sorry. I felt very much reminded of a bit of an old thing. There was this gentleman, Ebenezer Howard, who wrote this book, The Garden City, in 1898, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform. And I think it offers a few very valuable lessons. The first one is that he thinks very strategically. So he doesn't just develop the vision, but more importantly, also develops the economic and the governance mechanisms and so forth to actually make it happen. And I think that's where we are with the vertical landscape at the moment as well. But then a second more darker lesson is perhaps that, as we all know, it didn't really work out. So you want to change the mindset in a moment of massive crisis in the late 19th century. Then people as well didn't know what would be tomorrow. The cities were extremely polluted. People were dying. Maybe it must have felt very similar to what we're experiencing now as well with climate change and so forth. And yet we were not able to realize those amazing ideas to make it actually happen. I think from now on, we need to think about how do we strategize actually to make something like this actually happen. We have to build it in a current economic system. We have to convince people that are subscribing to current mindsets. We have established notions of public and private that we have practiced in the last decades, and especially in Japan. The privacy notion is so strong now that new buildings have ever smaller windows because you don't want to be seen. So how actually do we want to make it happen? I don't have any answer for that, but obviously we see, and we were convinced by the engineers today and by Florian as well, that we could start to build tomorrow. So how do we get all of these kind of different stakeholders into this? The stakeholder conundrum here, mixing transportation providers with agriculture, with housing, with office. How to manage all of this will be extremely challenging, and I think we can deal with this. I think there are a lot of very smart people all around the world who are grappling with this, and I think this will be a very, very exciting journey from now on to come to terms of this kind of more softer side of things, the management, the governance, grappling with existing mindsets in different cities and so forth. Sorry for the ramble. I wanted to add that to what has been said by the previous speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. So, if there are no more questions, are there any questions? There is one question.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I want just to ask in what kind of way are you going to progress with the project in the future? Because for me now, it's in the sort of between the abstract and getting real somehow. No? For when I listen to it, now I start all these questions come up in my mind. Like, for example, just as an example, the edge of the whole thing. This is probably quite fought over, maybe. You know? The plants want to live there, people want to lie there in the sun. I don't know what else is going to happen there. This is really very interesting space. Probably, what is the balustrade like, for example? No? How can I sit there or not? Can I fall over or not? Can I jump down there or not? And all these things. Is it dangerous space? Do I dare to go there? Or is it a very nice and cozy area? Or I don't know. All these. How do I enter my house from above? What is the door like? Do I open a latch? I don't know. And or what is this? Is it a cave dwelling sort of thing, or is there a structure coming out, or something moves out or not? All these things which sort of get the connection to real life going from what is now shown. That would be really cool to see. Are there any plans of continuing this design process?
Yeah, thank you. That's also, I think, a very, very relevant question. And as it is in an architectural process, some of these have been answered and addressed. And I think if we had the time to go back to some of the slides, you would actually get those ideas. Example, accessing those units where we had, I showed a little bit of some stairs that go up to the catwalks. Of course, there's also the possibility to have a barrier-free access from the top, etc. So this is one point, or balustrades, as you mentioned, of course, yeah. But we'll try to have plantation on those areas where there is going to be some sort of fence, but you don't necessarily have to see it, right? And so these very practical and pragmatic aspects, which are so important and can make any design good or bad in the end, I mean, a lot of them have actually been addressed. There are others which we are not at the stage of construction documents, of course, but I don't envisage major roadblocks there. Yeah, in terms of overcoming them as a practicing architect. I think those roadblocks, and that's I think also part of your question is, so how do we progress from there? If we could do it as a theoretical process, and we could do all project, and we could do solve all these questions that I've just described, but that's not going to get it built. So the roadblocks are really, and some of them are dangerous because they are unknowable at this point. What I've already mentioned is that the legislation that some of this I'm sure is not compatible with the building code. Actually, no. The funny thing, and I think that was really important, what Joachim showed, that we are deriving these spaces from a topography that exists, right? So it's walkable. It's really steep at some points, but it's how the ground condition of the city. Unfortunately, how the law is today, you can no longer build anything with a slope above 6% or whatever, right? So that would mean that we are now depending on a technology, i.e. the wheelchair, which I think is really not difficult to imagine that there will be a technological advancement that slopes more than 6% can be overcome by wheelchair users. I mean, that's really not difficult to imagine, right? But we are a lot of these structures is above 6%, as you could see from our graph. But you know what? So is the rest of the city. Yeah? And I think we have to think outside our conventional corset that we have been giving ourselves, where I think some of the legal constraints are close to a point where they're insane, right? I mean, and I think that's one of my favorite slides is really this, where you can see the vertical landscapes embedded in an area in Tokyo, and with the gradient analysis, and they look like a chameleon on it's completely one of the same language in terms of gradients. So that's something that I tend to emphasize. But how do we progress from here? And that's really the main question. And this event today and exhibiting here in Venice, and hopefully follow-up events like this are our stepping stones to first push out this message that there might be something that could address a lot of problems that we have today, and maybe some of them actually solve in a rather elegant way. So technologically, I think what we all wanted to prove is that technologically it's feasible from sustainability of social sustainability. I think very feasible, better than a lot of things that are being done right now. Environmentally, probably very feasible, and again better than what we are. What is on our table today. Economic feasibility, I think we have to really start thinking outside of the box in many aspects, because I can envisage very hard meetings with potential financial corporations that could pull something off like this. But I do have enough hope and energy to be able to overcome such a hurdle. I don't know if this answers your questions, but this would be my response.
Can I build a little bit on top of this about the ages condition of the project? So, so the location. Let's think about the location of the vertical landscapes in terms of microclimate, macroclimate, and then the microclimate conditions changes depending on the height, as Elizabeth shown. I think these two components, so where you are, climate conditions, and where the future climate condition, the microclimate condition going along the verticality of the tower, basically will define also the edges condition, right? I mean, we are looking at something which is, 100% open at the edge of the plate, but actually you will deal with different type of situations which will articulate the edges in different way. And one of that is also energy, renewable energy generation. The opportunity to have this very high, area around the building, which is something like 12 meters floor to floor height, which is again out of scale, right? I mean, you've got it 100 by 100, by each story is 12 meters. So it's an out of scale in terms of it's not a building. So how you articulate the edges in order to do a series of things regarding this is not really in and out. That's another unprecedented condition. You are not dealing with inside a building, a facade, and an outdoor space. You're actually dealing with an area which is permeable, but there is an in the units, there is an in between, and there is an out of the vertical landscape. So this is, again, another interesting topic to explore further.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much. It's hard for me to see what's going on in Tokyo, but if there are no questions, are there any questions in Tokyo? If not, then
no questions
we
in
will,
Tokyo.
I think, conclude it here for today. I would like to again express my big thanks to all the speakers and panelists. It's been a great pleasure. And also to the audience. I hear that we also had a live stream on YouTube. It was fantastic to have this opportunity. And as the last question pointed out, how do we progress from here? Please stay tuned and see what's going to happen. And it's going to take more than all of us. We really have to join forces and see how we can design a future that's quite enjoyable, I think. Thank you very much.